Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining. A warm welcome to this 10th session of our Lunch and Learn series. These seminars, as you might know already, are organized as part of the Chair on Online Content Moderation, a project directed by Suzanne Vergnol and funded by the Île-de-France region. The focus of our work is the regulation of online content moderation, as well as the legal framework that address these issues. And today, we have the pleasure of welcoming Paddy Leerssen, who will be in conversation with Bastien Savin, who has kindly accepted to moderate the session. And we will be discussing the role of platform ownership in the context of platform governance. Before I hand over the lead to Bastien, I wanted to remind you of another upcoming event that the chair will be holding this month on the 12th of March. We will be launching a visual guide to assist women victims of cyber violence. The event will take place at CNAM. I will send you the details in the link. It would only be in person, but then we will be publishing the documents online. So we'll be very happy if you could join us in person if you are in Paris. Otherwise, we look forward to your feedback once the output is published online. So without further ado, I will now give the floor to Bastien and Paddy. Thank you very much. And I'm very much looking forward to this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefania, for the introduction. So my name is Bastien Savin. It's my great pleasure to host this new edition of the Lunch and Learns. So first of all, a warm thank you to the chair for that opportunity. I have to say that the pleasure is even greater given our guest speaker for the day, who I do read a lot for my own research, Paddy Leerssen. Paddy, you are a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Amsterdam, more precisely at the Institute for Information Law. And many in this virtual room might also know you as one of the core members of the DSA Observatory project within the said institute. If they don't, well, I strongly recommend to have a look at the observatory's website, which is filled with insightful analysis. And of course, while you're at it, have also a look at the Chair on Content Moderation website. Paddy, a lot of your research focused on platform observability, and notably their algorithms. But today it's a different kind of scrutiny that you invite us to have, a look at the ownership of these platforms, trying to understand, using lessons from traditional media regulation, well, the impact of that ownership on content governance and the ways to go forward. So to do so, you draw from one of your latest publications with a telling name, which is on screen, From Murdoch to Musk, Platform Ownership and the Political Economy of Content Moderation. I will not spoil the fun too much on the content and let you develop on those issues. Just a quick mention on organizational aspects. So the presentation will be followed by about 20 minutes of questions and answers. So for the participants, feel free to write your questions in the chat, even as the presentation goes, and I will raise them in due time. So that being said, I think we should jump into today's topic. And for that, let me hand the floor over to you, Paddy.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Bastien, for that kind introduction. And of course, to Stefania, to Suzanne for the invitation. It's also nice to see some familiar names in the room, as well as many new ones too. And so Bastien's introduction already kind of covered it. This is something of a new topic for me. And it's also a non-legal topic, right? I consider myself first and foremost a legal scholar specialized in the DSA. But as I think is quite common, after completing one's PhD, can be a moment of reflection or even existential crisis, right? As you ponder what to do next. And I had this desire to move in this new direction of, let's say, political economy. And this is inspired by the realization I had at the time, looking back over these years of content regulation that I've studied, which a wave of regulation and reform starting roughly in 2015, or 2016, and asking myself, what have been the really momentous changes, the really radical changes to platform content governance over that period? And what I realized was that for me, the most obvious answer was not a legal one. The most radical change was not due to any legal reform, but due to Elon Musk's purchase of Twitter, right? Where he quite radically transformed practically all aspects of the service, from its name down to its content policies and its governance structures. And this made me realize, right, that this topic of ownership is so crucial in platform governance, but also really understudied. Outside of law, even in the broader platform governance literature, this topic of ownership rarely tends to be addressed. And to put it simply, you know, we talk a lot about stakeholders, but almost never about shareholders. And it left us, I think, poorly equipped to grapple with changes such as Musk's takeover. And as the title reflects, it strikes me that in other traditions, specifically in media research and in media regulation, there is a long-standing tradition, almost since the inception, of understanding ownership as crucial and subject of scrutiny in a way that we haven't been doing with platforms. And that's kind of the tradition I'm trying to recover and reapply in this context, and hence the title, from Murdoch to Musk. And as Bastien also mentioned, this has been published quite recently, last October, in Platforms and Society, as I think the first article in what I would consider a new research agenda for me. And hopefully it might inspire some of you as well. And in short, how I describe this project, if we can take as a research question, who owns the major social media platforms, and how do these owners influence content governance policies? It's really quite a basic or a descriptive question, I would say, since, as I said, there's quite little precedent to build on. And for me, that's a three-part project, right? Where we start with, and I'm going to discuss each of these, a theoretical framework based in political economy and media, right? So it's about revisiting this literature and then seeing what kind of concepts and methods we can extract from it. The second step is then to do, and this is the classic political economy of the media, two-step analysis, where you take an institutional mapping, who owns what being the basic question, and then you say, how do these economic structures, how do these ownership relationships in the next step change the outcomes? So in the past, we would have asked, how does Rupert Murdoch's ownership of Fox News influence its reporting outcomes? And in platforms, we ask, how does, let's say, an Elon Musk influence content policy and content governance decisions? Last week I gave a keynote on this topic as well at the University of Amsterdam, and there I've added in some more recent ideas, which are not yet in the paper, which are about the regulatory implications of all this. How does this new lens also provide new kind of regulatory pathways, as well as more recent updates? Actually, just after the paper was published, we had the TikTok deal, and I'm gonna, if we have the time, try to talk a little bit about that. But this is the basics from the paper. So let's start at the beginning. Like, why does ownership matter, and in what language can we talk about ownership? In the paper, I do a bit more of a detailed review of like the many different traditions of ownership research in media. So we can talk about, like, you know, class-based or even Marxist structuralist perspectives, like the famous work of Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman on the propaganda model is one example, and there are also other structuralist attempts from law and economics. So there's a more detailed review in the paper, but the one I really zoom in on is the media sociology approach, exemplified in the work of Rodney Benson, a very recent publication. If memory serves, it only came out last year, on media ownership, which really, I think, synthesizes a lot of divergent traditions into, I think, quite a rich and nuanced portrait of what ownership is and how it matters. And what we see here is the important point that ownership involves different forms, institutional forms, which go beyond what we know, for instance, from let's say antitrust law or media law, where we tend to look at ownership concentration at the level of the market, right? So there, what we might know from regulatory discussions, the question is, how many different firms are in the market, and how can we prevent monopolies from occurring, right? That's a typical analysis of ownership concentration that you would see in those areas. But the institutionalist approach doesn't just look at the market level, but actually looks at the specific composition of the firms within the market. It's a firm level analysis, and it shows that actually ownership within firms can be organized in different ways. And the book gives a fuller review showing also like non-market ownership forms like public ownership or non-profit ownership. But the models I focus on are the commercial ones, where we can distinguish between, on the one hand, market ownership and market control versus private ownership or private control, which are actually meaningfully different things, right? And also leads to meaningfully different media outcomes. So on the one hand, we have market control, which is typically associated with publicly listed firms, which tend to have very dispersed shareholdership. Many different firms are involved, often they're institutional investment firms. And these tend not to be very actively involved in the politics of, let's say, media, for instance. They tend to care almost exclusively about shareholder value. And this can be contrasted with situations where you have an individual or a family that actually controls the firm itself. This is typically for non-listed firms the case. And if you then have one individual or one family that has a controlling share of the firm, this means that they don't necessarily pursue shareholder value as their only goal. Now, of course, many individuals do prioritize shareholder value. Making a profit is typically one of their priorities, but it isn't necessarily the only priority. And the terms that Benson and his team use for this are political and economic instrumentalism. So you use the firm not just for its, let's say, intended purpose of shareholder value maximization, but for these other instrumental goals. And economic instrumentalism is the idea that you use the firm, you forego profits within the firm to, let's say, support your other investments. So maybe you use your newspaper to secure positive coverage of your telecommunications empire or your oil refineries or whatever other investments you might have. Political instrumentalism is the idea that you're foregoing profits, you're foregoing shareholder value to pursue an ideological agenda. And this is the typical model you would see for media oligarchs, the Rupert Murdochs of the world, for whom the question is often asked, are they doing this because it's a commercial strategy or just because they think it's important? And they would point, for instance, to the fact that people like Rupert Murdoch hold newspapers for a long time, even when they're loss leading within the firm, out of some kind of conviction that they're important for a political project. And so we see then how specific institutional compositions and ownership arrangements have different effects on the media's performance. How you then identify these kind of arrangements is quite a nuanced analysis. One of the most important ones is who has a controlling share of the vote within the firm. So ownership and shareholdership is important, but you can also look at other aspects to see who is actually in charge of a firm, who actually has control. Is there private control? And this is looking at, for instance, how the board is composed and who is the executive, whether the firm is publicly or privately listed, whether the firm is really dependent on other firms for its income or its financing, for instance. These are all aspects you can take into account, as is often done, for instance, in antitrust law as well, to establish whether there might be a risk of one individual or one family dominating a firm's decision-making. So that's the kind of lens I'm bringing to platform governance. And I want to ask you similar questions. How is ownership in this space organized, and what kind of implications will it have for the way that platforms govern online spaces? And this question, well, let me go back maybe one slide. I don't want to overload you with information. This question, as I said, is a fairly basic and descriptive one. Remarkably, there were few papers out there that gave me a clear answer, so I decided to do it myself. When it comes to publicly listed firms, we have quite a lot of information to draw on because they're required under US securities law to disclose who their major shareholders are. So a lot of what I'm doing in the paper is digging through the SEC database to understand, who are the major shareholders in the large listed platform firms. Then other firms such as X and TikTok are not listed publicly. They're private firms, and it's a bit harder to determine who the owners are. And that's something I'll get into in a bit. Now, the paper itself has like the full data. and that leads to tables such as this, where you can see all the major shareholders and their relationship to the firm's board, for instance. But rather than going through all of this, I'm going to go straight to some findings, some conclusions. And what we see is that on spectrum between private control and market control, there are actually really important differences between firms. I want to resist, therefore, the temptation to kind of generalize about oligarchy or these other concepts in platform governance, because there really are differences. So on the one hand, we have firms like Microsoft and Apple, which really exemplify the model of market control. They're publicly listed, they're highly diversified in their ownership, and the only entities that have more than 6% are large investment firms like BlackRock and Vanguard. Right, and technically these don't even really own that stock, they're kind of managing it on behalf of their clients. So these really aren't entities that are actively trying to steer like governance. These are typical passive investors. And this can be contrasted on the other end of the spectrum with a firm like Meta, where you have one individual who really dominates the firm, and that's Mark Zuckerberg. And two things are noteworthy here. The first is that this is enabled by a dual class stock structure, right, which is kind of a legal innovation from the last few decades, which means that certain Class B shares, as they're called, have many multiples more voting rights associated with them than the normal Class A shares. And those who hold the Class B shares, in this case Mark Zuckerberg, therefore are able, even though Mark Zuckerberg only has around, I think, 13% of the economic shares, he has 61% of the votes and therefore effective control. And then the second point is that he is not just the dominant shareholder, but he's also the CEO. So he's there in that capacity, very much involved in the day-to-day running of the firm. And thanks to his Class B stocks, he's actually very difficult to dismiss, right? Because the other shareholders do not have the votes to do so. Mark Zuckerberg still has a fiduciary obligation to respect the interests of his other shareholders, but that is, something that you'd have to litigate over and not so easy to exercise in practice. Now, then you have some other edge cases, let's say. So we can contrast a firm like Alphabet with Meta, because on the one hand, it does have a dual class stock structure. So it's not as diversified as the typical market firms. But unlike Meta, first of all, you have two people that are sharing control. We have Larry Page and Sergey Brin. And second of all, neither of them is CEO. In fact, in 2019, both kind of withdrew from public or active management of the firm. So while they're still on the board, this is really not the same as Meta, where you have one individual really calling all the shots. Now, looking at private firms, I'll skip this for now. Interestingly, typically the assumption in media research is that public firms are market controlled and private firms tend to be privately controlled, but that's actually not necessarily the case. So when we look at TikTok, which is a private firm, based on what we know, it's relatively more diversified in its control than something like Meta. According to its own disclosures, they have about 20% held by the firm's founders, 20% by employees, and 60% by a diverse array of institutional investors. So here, this is really unlike Meta, with an individual that's controlling it and closer to a market model, although still more concentrated than something like Microsoft. And finally, X is an intriguing one, because actually, after it was taken private by Elon Musk, it was kind of hard to determine who exactly was involved and what their stakes were. And the information that we do have is really only available because Jacob Silverman, a journalist, intervened in this case, in employment litigation against X, and he asked the judge to unseal information about the investors. So it is basically through his actions that we were able to learn more. We don't still know the actual numbers of shares that people hold, the quantities, but we do know the identities of shareholders, which are almost 100 of them, including Elon Musk. So many, for instance, Larry Ellison, the guy who's now involved in buying TikTok, is also one of the major investors. We see Saudi Arabia has a role. Also, P. Diddy was a surprising name for me to see on the list. But so it was intriguing for me to see how little we actually knew unless litigation happened to disclose it. And since then, X has actually been restructured several times, so the reality may have changed. So this problem of transparency in non-listed firms is one I'm going to return to. Now, so that's kind of the structure of who owns what. If we had more time, I could also get into more detail about TikTok USA. I'm going to skip that for now for reasons of time, but we can return to it. The short version is that This is not as concentrated as something like Meta, but of course, the role that the US government plays does seem to indicate that there's very much the intent to shape content moderation because of this. So let's get to that question. How do owners shape content governance? In the longer version, I go through all the different examples we could give of Elon Musk changing policy at his firm. Instead, I'll just refer to an excellent paper that's already been written on this topic by João Magalhães and his colleagues. They do a wonderful review of all the changes. And the point I'll make here is that Musk really exemplifies, I think, the idea of political instrumentalism that I was talking about. You know, even by his own admission, he's saying that Twitter for him is not a way to make money, but for him it's a bid to protect civilization and to protect free speech. Now, we can disagree as to whether he's done that, but it's certainly clear that he has not made money, right? He's actually lost a lot of money with X. It's almost gone bankrupt by almost valuations. It's halved in value since his acquisition. And so the idea that he's doing this for non-commercial consideration seems to be pretty clear. And we see here social media taking on a function that media used to have in the past as a loss-leading instrument of political power for the billionaire class. And I want to contrast this kind of archetypical example of political instrumentalism at X with what we see at Facebook, which I think is a bit more layered and a bit more complex. So with Meta under Zuckerberg, on the one hand, there is a case to be made that he is similarly engaging in political instrumentalism to pursue his own viewpoints. This idea was discussed last year when Zuckerberg very visibly announced like quite radical changes to content policy at his firm. At the same time, while he seemed to be going through this kind of political awakening of sorts and taking on this kind of MAGA Silicon Valley tech bro aesthetic as well. So people think, wow, did this change of heart, did this one individual's change suddenly, result in this radical shift? In that sense, the comparison to X is available. But I also want to point out that not so much longer after Mark Zuckerberg announced radical changes last January, for instance, to stop fact checking and to permit more hate speech on the platform, is that many other firms followed suit, right? So most of the major firms, including those held by Microsoft, for instance, LinkedIn, also withdrew from their fact checking commitments under the DSA. So the question I pose there is this a question of divergence between the oligarchically controlled, individually controlled firms and the market firms, or are the market firms actually realigning as well? So like a middle ground position might be that a individually led firm like Facebook is able to undertake quite radical changes in a way that other market firms are not, but that once those changes are taken, the other market firms are then able to follow suit. So there are kind of interactions there that deserve, I think, more analysis. And I'm not coming up with definitive answers here. And that kind of leads me to conclude, I think, on the research agenda I see going forward in this space, because I think there are many more questions that can be asked. So to sum up, we see that owners are not necessarily or structurally involved in shaping content policies, but they still retain the power to assert that influence once it attracts their attention. That's, for instance, what we saw with Zuckerberg. When they do intervene, these billionaires typically have pushed for weaker moderation, for collaboration with authoritarian governments, and boosted algorithmic visibility for their own personal accounts. That's something we've seen both Zuckerberg and Elon Musk do. And we need to ask ourselves, what that is motivated by. Is this, out of interest for their economic considerations in other investments? For instance, the fact that Elon Musk has far larger investments in Tesla or in SpaceX, and for instance, their dependency on subsidies from the US government is a very significant factor to consider. Or is this really an ideological quest, a political conviction? Or in fact, are these just the more visible outcroppings of something that's happening across the market? And this, I think, requires much more sustained comparative analysis. Now, just to wrap up, because I promised this, the follow-up questions that I kind of explore in the keynote as well are about how this feeds into regulation. On the one hand, I think the TikTok deal really signals a new paradigm coming from the US that is centered around ownership. Whereas the EU is writing laws to govern speech online, the US buys shares. And it's very explicit that the TikTok deal for them is a way to influence how content is governed online. Then we have a discussion that's possible about how the EU can respond to this new paradigm, which can involve, for instance, digital sovereignty, i.e. building your own platforms, but also other more short-term things, such as, I think, arguing for ownership transparency is something we've done in media law, we need to be able to know who own these firms, and that's not a radical demand to make. We need to consider our own foreign ownership restrictions. I happen to know that France, for instance, limits foreign ownership of French language newspapers, and that's a model we can apply, much like the US has done with TikTok, to our own platforms. And we need to also talk about how, like the media, we can demand that management of these decisions within the firm is isolated from ownership influence. In the same way that we have editorial safeguards for media professionals, might we not also have safeguards for the independence of trust and safety professionals? So those are the kind of the exploratory points I wanted to make, and hopefully we can use the rest of the time for questions. So thank you very much for your time. Yeah, there we go.
Thank you, Paddy. There's already a few questions in line. So since we only have 30 minutes, I guess let's start with them. We have a first question from Suzanne Verniol saying, thank you, Paddy, for a great presentation. Can you elaborate a bit on the methods that can be used to obtain data ownership information for non-listed firms? I understand that it's thanks to an unsealing of documents ordered by a court that helped get information. What other avenues can be used? Can freedom of information access requests help us in this?
Yeah, thanks, Suzanne. That's a nice question. I mean, maybe you have more of the answer than I do, seeing as you are the FOIA expert in the room, as far as I know. I can tell you a bit more about the case. So this was employment litigation that was ongoing in the US, and these journalists, Jacob Silverman, working together with a free speech, or free press rather, NGO, intervened in that case for the unsealing of the documents. But this is really like incidental or opportunistic approach to this. I'll also note that in the leaked European Commission decision on X, which you may have seen, which is leaked by the House of Representatives in the US, a large portion of it, like the first 10, 15 pages, are about this question: who actually owns X? Because for the Commission, of course, this is like a precondition for establishing who is responsible to pay the fines, and then ultimately also what the size of those fines would be. Interestingly, the House actually redacted some of the most interesting and important parts of that thing. So I was hoping to learn a little bit more about the ownership structure there myself, but ultimately I didn't learn so much. I think there are 2 points that follow from this. First is, my fear is that similar logic will be applied in FOIA, right? So governments probably do know this, but they might still excise this as some kind of confidential information or a trade secret, or use other carve-outs they can to still, pull the black marker over the ownership information we care about. So that would be my concern with the FOIA approach. On the other hand, there is a fact that this knowledge is there within governments, because they need to know about ownership structures for effective enforcement. And that's why I think, I point to media law, where we have ownership transparency requirements in EMFA, which, it allows or requires member states to implement their own ownership transparency requirements on media services. And, at the national level, that's something that's been in place for many decades. And with that in mind, I think making the similar demand of platforms is eminently reasonable.
So to follow up quickly and maybe lead to Stefania's question, you mentioned the Commission's decision and the fact that they try to identify who's the entity controlling X. But interestingly, they also go back to Elon Musk himself, considering that they do observe he has these ownership powers, as you described them. And he did manifest publicly in multiple instances that he was willing, at least, to influence content governance. And so, well, first I was curious about your opinion on these personal indictments of Musk, but I think it also leads to Stefania's question, which says, I wonder to what extent the ownership configuration structure could be useful in establishing the platform's responsibilities. One of the arguments against piercing the corporate veil, if I'm not mistaken, is the idea that the company, being a legal entity, it's difficult to attribute specific responsibilities. Would this reasoning change / be countered if we can clearly establish that decision-making remains in the hands of one person, as for Meta?
Yeah, thanks. I think that's a really interesting set of questions, which I'm only really, I have to admit, starting to grapple with myself, as I turn to kind of the regulatory implications of all this. And I think that's one that definitely in the X decision was on the table, right? Also for the calculation of fines, it seems that if you do it on the basis of X's revenue, you're really not going to get a strong deterrent effect on someone like Musk, is as one of the arguments that could be made, right? And do you then need to consider the like these broader investments in firms like Tesla or SpaceX is a direction you could go. I'm really not sure whether that's feasible under EU law. Like that's something I would need to research myself further as well. The broader point I want to make here, I think, is that we're seeing questions of corporate governance and corporation law become more and more relevant here, I would say, right? And that's kind of a point I make in the paper as well, that, as a regulatory object, we tend to focus on platforms as a technology, right? So we talk about a platform as a set of infrastructures or APIs, or maybe even as a service. But of course, there's when we talk about something like YouTube, it is as much a corporation as it is a set of technologies, right? And these two can be targets of regulation. So I think kind of broadly a turn to corporate governance is something that's really sensible here, and that has implications for things like liability and piercing the culprit veil, things like fiduciary responsibilities that these CEOs or shareholders might have vis-a-vis other shareholders, as well as I think the internal management of the firm, where again I take a page from media law, or excuse me, also from media governance. The questions of how do internal management structures, should they be isolated from influence of executives or ownership? Should they be isolated from influence of advertisers? That's a question of editorial independence that's been really long-standing in media, and media corporate governance, media management. And things we don't tend to talk about as much in the platform context.
So continuing on this corporate context, we have a question from Thomas Hughes saying, thanks Paddy, really interesting presentation. Given the composition of market ownership of platforms and private ownership when spread across multiple individuals, would you consider shareholder activism a feasible route to affect change on platform current content policy, or consumer activism, such as the current resist and unsubscribe movement?
Yeah, thanks, Thomas. That's a really nice kind of follow-up to the previous question, I guess. And it's one that came about the conference as well. I'm going to be getting a kind of on the one hand, on the other hand answer here. So I think there is a space for this, in the sense that political instrumentalism, almost per definition, it is something that would risk violating fiduciary obligations, right? If there is fiduciary obligation to work in the interest of the other shareholders, and you're admitting, I'm actually foregoing profits, or maybe they're not admitting it, but if you can establish that they're foregoing profits for some other political motive, then you have to ask yourself, is that an intention with this fiduciary obligation? There are, I think, to put a finer point on that, if you look at Elon Musk saying this is not a way for me to make money, especially for the publicly listed firms, if Mark Zuckerberg were to say this is not a way for me to make money, you'd have a lawsuit on his hands in minutes, you'd have to imagine, right? So typically in the larger firms, the publicly listed firms with a larger number of shareholders and greater kind of transparency, that kind of scrutiny of fiduciary obligations is likely to be much larger, right? And might be a plausible pathway for accountability too. So that's maybe the optimistic account, let's say. And then the caveats there are that, first of all, you have a set of private firms such as X or such as TikTok, where the shares aren't freely traded, and any kind of public values oriented group might actually struggle to even get a foot in the door for the first part. And then the other caveat is that, and this is something I actually get into much more nuance in the paper, is while I've kind of really contrasted the private and the market logic, there are many ways in which they still align, right? And so there is a great alignment between the free speech libertarianism of Elon Musk as a political ideology and the severe need to cut costs after interest rates increased after the COVID crisis, right? So we saw layoffs across all of Silicon Valley. Again, so there are these ways in which we can also see market realignments and market logics operating in a very similar way to the oligarchic logics of someone like Elon Musk, which is to say that even what is commercially optimal or valuable for these firms is not necessarily what we might expect from a public interest or public values perspective, right? And this is like a nuance that's very much acknowledged and something we can learn from in media research as well, right? Where it's quite clear that the private logic has risks and downsides, where you have individual oligarchs kind of basically undermining media pluralism, having disproportionate influence over public discourse. But on the other hand, the private model also enables kind of non-market public values to be pursued, right? So not only News Corp is privately owned by Rupert Murdoch, but the New York Times is privately owned as well by a family that tends to value, I think, high quality and independent journalism, right? So, in the 70s and the 80s, the corporatization of the media, the move towards market logics and the move towards publicly listed large media conglomerates was actually seen as detrimental to the values of high quality journalism, right? So you can have actually quite a nuanced debate about when and how like a private logic might be preferable to a market logic in this space too. And that ties into the question of the fiduciary obligation as well. Like maybe just a cost-cutting shareholder maximization isn't always going to be in the best interest of the public either.
On that scale of like the way you describe it, it sounds like there's this scale between political, let's say, content governance linked to ownership and the more market-driven logics. But in any case, like you described, there's no real better solution in a way because they each have their own flaws. And I was wondering, you were talking about more transparency regarding the ownership and maybe more control on foreign investments. But what do you think about radical solutions that are now being exposed as disconnecting completely ownership and algorithms in the sense that you would allow users to choose their own recommendation algorithms and stuff like that? Do you think, because obviously it would kill most of the platform's business model, but do you see this as, in a way, the ultimate solution to prevent these ownership influence over content moderation, or even there do you see some limitations to the approach?
Thanks. Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think this interoperability idea can be approached in different ways. So one version, which is close to like data portability, would be about really kind of decentralizing platform markets and like dispersing control. So you have like Mastodon or Fediverse type ideas where you really disperse control. And that solves the problem at the level of market concentration rather than firm concentration. You can have many firms that are totally like autocratically controlled by individuals, but if you can choose effectively and meaningfully between 30 or 40 different firms, then that's not so much of a concern, right? So it's only really because I think I've kind of accepted that in the short term we can't solve this problem. Like you have this natural monopoly, you have these network effects, you have these economies of scale. So we can't solve this by having 30 different social media firms. Like that's just my assumption for now. Therefore, you need to look at democratizing ownership within those firms. If you believe that you can achieve this, then that would be one way of attacking the problem of oligarchic influence as well. You specifically asked about like algorithmic interoperability, which is, I think, a slightly different version of interoperability, where you say, well, we have the same firms, but the specific functionalities are kind of carved out, and we can create a market for recommender systems, let's say. Now, I have many questions about the technical feasibility of something like this, but still, I think what's interesting to me is that it still reinforces ultimately a market logic. No, this is not the government saying, we want, let's say, due prominence for public broadcasting content, is something like this. It's not the government imposing a positive vision of what news values should be online. It's a vision in which the problem is a lack of user choice, and we need more choice and more competition to make that work better. Like, I'm not sure I share that diagnosis. But what I will say, and this I think is an interesting development also for me, an unexpected one, is the TikTok deal, right? Where what we've seen is the when it started, the idea was, I think, mainly centered around like the local storage of user data. But the final version of the deal includes the transfer of content moderation and content curation, like recommender functions, to this US joint venture. And that's something that I'd barely consider feasible before this was mentioned. I'm still very curious how that's going to work out, because, can you really separate out moderation or recommendation from one, user group from others within the same platform? Clearly, they think it is possible, and I'm very curious how they're going to achieve that, because that could potentially, for whatever else you think of, like the people involved and the motives behind the TikTok deal, that is a model that could potentially be interesting for other jurisdictions to explore as well, right? So can we have a local European version of a TikTok recommender algorithm or an Instagram recommender algorithm? That's, I think, a very interesting question, and I'm going to be studying that TikTok deal closely to see how that pans out.
Right, thank you, Paddy. Maybe going back on questions linked to the whole legacy media comparisons, there was a question from Stefania a bit earlier saying, to what extent do you think that the discourse around the idea that social media is different than traditional media has affected the lack of research in this area? The discourse around platform governance has been really focused on how platforms are intermediaries, they don't have editorial control, etc. So perhaps this has prevented us from drawing similarities between traditional and social media. And I think this also links to Suzanne's last questions, asking what are the steps that could be done to transpose media principles to platform law? Is there anything relevant on this topic in the European Media Freedom Act?
Yeah, thank you. It's an interesting question I've been turning around in my mind. These lessons for media law, treating platforms or social media like media firms, in a way, this is not at all a new argument, right? People have been fighting over whether platforms are telecom or media for like more than a decade. But I do feel like there's a new spin on the argument that I'm trying to make, or different implications that I'm taking from that, what is ultimately a metaphor, which is to say, again, I think it's a turn to corporate governance. So in the past, when we talked about our platform's media, we were talking about liability questions, basically. We were asking, if it's like the media, they should have publishers' liability and like primary liability for whatever they publish, etc. That was the implication we were taking from that metaphor. What I'm interested in is the corporate governance aspects, precisely, right? So transparency of shareholders, internal management safeguards and independence vis-a-vis ownership and executives, foreign ownership restrictions, right? And that's exactly to Suzanne's questions. These are all things we can find in EMFA, and I think are interesting to consider for platforms as well. And that's not, at least how I've seen this debate pan out, it's not what people have taken away from the media analogy yet. So like, I think, the basic comparison isn't new, but the specific lessons we're drawing are different. And that has to do with moving from a technological or a media-based analysis of like, what is the product being served, to a corporate governance analysis of what implications will it have for the firm. And then finally, I think to Suzanne's question, I think it is important to stress also then there are differences, of course, between platforms and media that need to be taken into account. So something like ownership transparency is relatively straightforward to transpose, I would say, since ultimately these are still firms with similar legal structures as regards ownership. But when it comes to something like this idea of editorial independence, there's a lot more difficulty and complications, I believe. because obviously the decision-making process of an editor at a news firm is very different from the decision-making processes at platform firms. Indeed, if you look at EMFA, they really define platforms as not exercising editorial control, and it talks about organizational control instead. And so you need to think about what does independence look like in that context. If it's not editorial independence, but let's call it organizational independence or trust and safety independence or whatever you want to call it. That requires, I think, a different model. So one idea I'm floating, but this is really more in the exploratory phase, is they have some kind of separation between, on the one hand, the formulation of the policies, right? So there's the executives and the owners behind them have the mandate to determine like what is the actual content policy. But then when it comes to applying that policy in specific cases, maybe there need to be some safeguards for the trust and safety professionals in charge of this, right? And that's a sentiment we also see in the DSA. In Article 14, for instance, which requires a consistency and a regard for fundamental rights in the enforcement, as well as in like its ODS provisions, right? Which suggests that once a platform has certain rules in place, they cannot be entirely arbitrary in how they subsequently kind of enforce them. And that if you read the memoirs of like trust and safety professionals, like which I also cite in my paper, this is a frustration they express. That they are working on devising policies, which then, when Mark Zuckerberg got requests from the Russian government, he decided to comply with, and then the trust and safety people say, hey, this is a total contradiction of the policy we've just formulated. So there are interesting tensions between like the trust and safety staff and the executives, which speak to an arbitrariness that maybe the law wants to prevent. Whereas the DSA has been looking at this strictly at the level of like outcomes and individual decisions. Maybe that's something you also want to have reflected in the organizational composition of the firm. And that's something we do have in media law, but not yet in platform governance.
Do you think on these like internal firewalls and organizational structure that the fact that the commission sanctioned Musk personally, and I don't know to what extent this is going to stand in front of the general courts, and whether they find it convincing given the spirit of the DSA. But do you think this could be a way of saying, well, you're supposed to respect independence between the ownership and the platform, the ownership of the platform and content moderation, and if you don't, well, we're gonna hold you liable for the acts of the company itself. And in a way, could have a deterring effect. I'm not sure Elon Musk is that much afraid by EU sanctions, but for other CEOs, maybe that this could be a way of saying you should preserve independence, editorial independence. Otherwise, you'll also be personally liable.
Yeah, that is an interesting argument to make. I would have to study the decision, which is very long, in a bit more detail to have like a firm sense of what the commission seems to be doing. Like my sense is that the DSA, like when you compare it to EMFA, really doesn't have this kind of explicit like requirement in there, but there are like a few ways in which existing norms can start to maybe limit editorial independence. And one you say, and which Fanny also mentioned, is this idea of, well, maybe this is a question of piercing the corporate veil, and a certain degree of interference then moves you into personal liability. Like that's one set of answers. Another set of answers is, I think, related to what I just mentioned, the standards for non-arbitrariness in content moderation that the DSA has, where interference from the executive could be taken as like prima facie evidence of an arbitrary intervention. That's like maybe another approach. And the third, which I'll mention, is that the systemic risk framework, first of all, does mention like in various ways organizational aspects as relevant, even though it doesn't have anything like an editorial independence norm to kind of specify that, but it talks about organizational aspects, and it also talks about media pluralism. And for me, that's an important one. Like for me, that's ultimately what this boils down to. It's a question of pluralism. You have one very rich, wealthy individual that can then, with that wealth, have all these decisions go their way, right? So maybe that's an angle to consider. But overall, I think, when you look at EMFA, there are ways of making this much more specific and much more clear.
I see Stefania typing in the chat. Maybe it's a new question coming. Okay. Sorry, I'm reading the chat out loud live. I think it drew from corporate governance. And perhaps the litigation in the UK where voluntary commitments have been deemed to bind the company. These companies have committed to some sort of human rights protection. Do we have any other questions? It's not a question, more of a comment. All right. No more questions in the chat. One more. Okay. Stefania's typing. Well, yeah, Stefania, you can speak, so maybe it's easier.
Yes, I think I'll abuse my position here. I had a question that came to mind when you were discussing this idea of, one solutions could be breaking this monopoly in a way, but this would still be based on the market rather than governmental intervention. But my question on this is, to what extent do you think that this monopoly can actually be broken even from a market perspective? Because I think one of the main differences perhaps between platforms and social media platforms and other monopolies is this idea that they are inextricably linked with the digital public sphere and how we form connections. So there is this idea that there are costs in leaving these platforms, and perhaps we have also seen it with the migration to Blue Sky, right? Which didn't seem to work as effectively as the old Twitter was. So I'm wondering to what extent we can really hope that this could actually happen, and at the same time, governmental intervention. Yes, if these principles are, if the government does not then abuse their power to then use platforms to censor or control. So it's like we are stuck into between two weird positions here on how to solve this. I don't know if it's clear.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, this is kind of the long-standing question of platform power and how you can disperse or provide alternatives to it, which is, I think, the obvious backdrop for this specific decision on like shareholder power within those dominant firms. In short, I think we have seen tendencies on, let's say, the progressive side to, I think, still think default to ideas of user choice and user empowerment as central here, even though, like, in many ways, arguably the problem we have right now is too much kind of, let's say, catering to users' immediate wants to the detriment of, let's say, news and quality. Everyone seems addicted to their phones, and do we want to give them even more of what they want? Like, is that in that sense the problem? That it's a specific framing that like, I'm not sure that giving people even more control over like an algorithm that caters to them is necessarily going to like really solve those questions that we're concerned about. Of course, then there is a risk that the alternatives you provide end up becoming like propagandistic, or censorious in their own way, right? One problem here is that this idea of censorship is problematic in the context of recommender system governance, because whatever choice you make, whatever you put in number one, something else is going to have to be at the bottom, right? So there is there's no such thing as a neutral recommender system, and there's inevitably political choices that need to be made there, and what goes to the top. I think, again, the analogy to media is instructive, because we have found ways in media to give government a constructive role without that necessarily being propagandistic in the proud tradition of European public broadcasting, which has been a wonderful boon to like educational, current affairs, and all sorts of other content. Of course, there have been problems with its independence from the state, but that's just true for commercial media as well. And the way we do that is by innovation at the level of the corporation and its ownership and its organization, rather than any kind of technological innovation, right? We have public broadcasters that are not state-owned, but they are publicly owned. We have newspapers that are owned by non-profit associations. So there's a whole debate there about the wonderful diversity of different non-profit ownership structures we have for media in Europe that insulate them both from state power and from oligarchic and market control, right? So, and in the work of people like Rodney Benson, as I said, I just looked at the examples that are relevant for platforms right now, which are market and private ownership. But in that book, you will also find discussions of as I said, nonprofit associations, cooperations, public broadcasting as these alternative models, which I think we need to consider for platforms. And the final point I'll make as we enter and the last few minutes here is that then the question, okay, but where do these owners enter the picture? Am I saying that the Dutch public broadcaster needs to start its own social media platform? No, probably not, right? There are two ideas that interest me at the moment. So there's the digital sovereignty movement, which is kind of pushing for the creation of some kind of domestic European alternatives, which, if achievable, would be great. I think that would probably need to be coordinated at European level to be feasible, right? That we have this real big problem of isolated language groups, making it difficult to get to the kind of scale you want for something like this. So I'm kind of broadly skeptical of that being feasible. And that's why I find the TikTok deal such an interesting precedent, because what it shows is that you can actually take an existing platform and split off certain parts for local governance, right? So you find the users where they're at and you alter the ownership relations there, and it takes kind of political courage for a government to take that step, but it can be done, right? And then of course, if we go down that path, the goal would not be to replace the US oligarchs that now own TikTok USA with European oligarchs owning TikTok EU, but then to consider, okay, how can the public broadcasting tradition, how can the non-profit tradition inform the way we go about creating those alternatives? And that seems to me, challenging, but perhaps more realistic than getting the Dutch public broadcaster to make their own social media platform.
All right, maybe Stefania, it's time to close.
Yes. I'll give you the floor. Yes, thank you.
So, well, let me thank one more time Paddy Leerssen for joining us today. I don't think we can have a virtual round of applause on this one, but yeah, thank you for your insights and for this very original view, definitely on content regulation. I'm also thanking sincerely Suzanne Verniol, so the chair director, and Stefania Di Stefano, who's a postdoctoral researcher, for their kind invitation to this Lunch and Learn. The next event will take place on March 7th. No, is it March? March 7th? April.
Yes.
April 7th, sorry, wrong notes. So on April 7th from 12:30 to 1:30, like today. And the chair will have the pleasure to welcome Jessica Gallisser, Senior Policy Researcher for Interface on age verification, and more precisely on, alors it's a French topic, protection des mineurs en ligne, la vérification de l'âge et ses limites. So you will have guessed that it's going to be held in French, but the chair looks forward to welcome you from Lunch and Learn. And in the meantime, thank you everyone, and have a great afternoon.
Thanks everyone, take care.